Welcome to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Today's seminar is titled NGSS Core Ideas, Biological Evolution, Unity, and Diversity. Our presenter today is Cindy Passmore. My name is Christina Crawley, and I will be moderating today's program. Jeff Lehman is also online to help with technical support. I'd also like to remind you to visit the NSTA Learning Center, your online portal for professional learning and over 11,400 resources for science educators. You'll find that over 4,000 of those resources are free, and you can add them to your library to access when it's convenient for you. You can organize your resources by bundling them into collections or accessing thousands of other collections made by NSTA and other teachers. Join the conversation in the community forums where you can discuss content and classroom issues with other teachers. Our online advisors are also available to help you find your information that you're looking for. And of course, you can also use our free tools to help you organize your own professional development and meet your goals. It's all available at learningcenter.nsta.org. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Here with us, we have Cindy Passmore, and she's joining us from the West Coast at the University of California, Davis. And with that, I'm going to pass the reins on to Cindy. Enjoy the session, everyone.
Hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. My talk button was grayed out, but it came back to me a second ago, so maybe it's going to be okay. Welcome, everyone, to this session on the disciplinary core idea, LS4, evolution, unity, and diversity. I'm glad you could all be here today, and I look forward to a lively chat time. I didn't put a lot of polls and things into the presentation itself, but I do have budgeted a good amount of time for us to talk, so hopefully we can have some lively discussion as we go. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be up to today. The first thing is why disciplinary core ideas, and how is the disciplinary core idea approach different? And I think that probably a number of you have already grappled with this question, and I'm not going to be saying much new there, so we'll speed through that pretty quickly. And then we'll take up the question of what makes LS4, evolution, unity, and diversity, a core idea, and explore what the component ideas are all about, and how to think about that cluster of content in a way that that might be productive and in line with the intentions of the framework and NGSS. And then we'll have a quick break for discussion and conversation. And then we'll move into thinking about learning progressions and how we make this content and the ideas developmentally appropriate, and what we can do to build across time. And then we'll spend a fair bit of time talking about common student ideas. So there's a lot of literature, and a lot of you as teachers, I'm sure, have experienced working with students who have trouble with some ideas around evolution and natural selection. And we'll spend some time talking about that research and my own experience, and hopefully then we'll break into another question and answer session where you all can also share some of your thoughts and ideas. And then I'm going to show you some teaching resources. These are mostly, I'll talk a little bit as we go about elementary ideas, thoughts about how to do things in elementary. The two particular examples I've pulled are from middle and high school, but you can imagine we can talk and we can discuss in the chat time some ideas about what to do with the younger kids as well. So with that, we'll get going. So who am I? I'm a stretched out, silly looking picture, I guess. I'm a faculty member in science education at the University of California, Davis. I've been here for 12 years, and before that I did my doctoral work at the University of Wisconsin. A little shout out to Karen Mesmer, I see you there. And I have spent my time and my intellectual effort investigating student learning and teacher learning in modeling context. So what does it mean to engage in modeling in school, the scientific practice of modeling? And one particular context in which I've done that work has been in life science, and in particular around evolution and natural selection. So I think that's what brings me here. I myself am a former high school science teacher, and so hopefully can bring that to bear. And I want to say that I do a lot of work with our pre-service teachers here at UC Davis, and all of my work is done in collaboration with practicing teachers, and I couldn't do it without them. So I'm happy to be among a bunch of teachers right now, and hope to hear from you throughout the presentation as well. So we already did this, so we won't do this again. So it seemed like there was a pretty even spread between middle and high school, being the bulk of the folks, some 3 through 5 teachers, a handful of pre-K, and college and university folks. So we're not going to do this one again because you just did it. But I do want to do this poll, which is, I'm just curious, when you think about a year-long instructional sequence, and maybe you don't think about it this way, but where do ideas about evolution come up in your class? Do they come up at the beginning of the school year as a standalone unit? Are they woven, maybe they're woven throughout the curriculum and there is no, like, quote-unquote unit on evolution or ideas related to evolution? Or do they come at the end? Often I see teachers doing it as a kind of a culminating unit, and then obviously some of you may not teach evolution depending on the grade level at which you teach or whatnot. So I'll give you a moment to answer the poll question, and when Christina thinks it's done, then we can publish the results and see what people think.
Great, and just in case anyone joined us at the end there, if you want to use the poll button, it's just below your name on the left-hand side. There's 4 buttons, and then you can pick from that drop-down option. If for some reason you can't join that one, that's preferable. You're welcome to also put your answer in the chat box, but to be part of the whole final tally, it's best to use the poll. Okay, it looks like most people there's no new answers really, so I'm going to go ahead and publish the results on the screen there, and then you can take it from there. So,
okay, so oops, we're both moving at the same time. Tug of war. So it looks like, well, a fair number of you didn't answer, so that probably means my thoughts of responses didn't correspond with what you actually do. But a lot of people do this sort of weaving, which seems productive to me, and not very many people start the school year. So, and maybe it was the standalone unit that caught people there, but one of the things that I think is really a wonderful opportunity that we have with the next generation science standards and the way the writers of the framework have laid out the disciplinary core ideas is for some really interesting weaving together of a number of ideas, both within biology and across, obviously with the cross-cutting concepts across different disciplines as well. But that's tricky from a teacher's perspective, right, to know how to weave but also go deep. And so I think that that's a tension that we'll maybe explore a little bit as we go. So what makes a core idea? And this is just straight from the framework, and I'm sure is familiar to many of you. So how is a core idea? One of the things that that I experience myself as a teacher, and I see a lot when I go out into classrooms, is that the way teachers organize their curriculum is around topic areas. So, and evolution might be one of those topics, or natural selection, or fossils, or all kinds of different subparts of what we're going to be talking about today might be a topic in typical curriculum parlance. And I think one of the things that we're pushing on with NGSS is to pull ourselves away from thinking about topics and into thinking about this notion of a core idea. And so what the framework says, and the position the framework takes, is that a core idea is one that has broad importance in the discipline, is a key tool for understanding the discipline, and is relevant to societal and or personal concerns. And those two things need not be mutually exclusive, but it doesn't always have to have high personal relevance, right? It could be an idea that has high societal relevance. And that the ideas are complex and generative, that they're ideas from which we build our understanding of the world and of the natural world. So the notion in the framework around core ideas is that they're not topics, and this is not about covering stuff. It is about understanding, developing understanding of a small number of core ideas that are actually foundational in the discipline. And that's a little different orientation than I think that we've had in science education for a long time, in that it pushes us to think about what are the most basic and also the most generative. And what I mean by generative are these ideas that pull us into thinking hard about what we see in the natural world and how we might make sense of it and explain it. And that the ideas themselves get us some traction on that. When we think about topics, they may or may not be very well motivated or connected to the natural world. Another reason to think about this sort of difference between, as many people have said, a mile wide and an inch deep, is the issue around whether or not we could ever possibly create a science curriculum or set of science standards or list of topics that would be comprehensive, truly comprehensive. And given that that is a futile task, that the disciplines of science are too big and moving too fast and evolving, excuse the pun, too quickly to keep students up to date on the scientific discoveries of the time, then our task really becomes a different one, and that is really to think about what are the ideas that will allow them to launch themselves into the 21st century and understand the natural world and all of the amazing scientific achievements and accomplishments that they may be part of and may be witness to in the coming century. What are the ideas that underlie all of that they have to have under their belt in order to make sense of that for the rest of their lives? And that's really, to me, the difference between being a core idea and a topic. So I'll leave that there. In the framework, something I really appreciate the way the framework writers went about their task was to create these sets of questions, and each core idea section begins with a set of questions. So the two questions that underlie the evolution, unity, and diversity core ideas are: how can there be so many similarities among organisms, yet so many different plants, animals, and microorganisms? And that's a really fun question to explore with kids. And that exploration can start very young. And then the second question is a little bit more utilitarian for humans, which is: how does biodiversity affect humans? So the core ideas in the framework, and most of you are familiar with this structure, so I'll get a move on here, is the four are from molecules, the structures and processes, the ecosystem level stuff, heredity, and biological evolution. And then within evolution, we have this evidence of common ancestry and diversity. We have natural selection, adaptation, biodiversity, and humans. Okay, so what does this all mean? When I see lists, my inclination is to think about sequences. But I don't believe that's the intent of the framework writers, nor do I think that's a productive way to think about these ideas as they unfold for kids. So the list, A through B, is not a suggested sequence. I just want to be clear about that, and then we'll explore that idea a little bit further. Instead, the 4 component ideas are meant to collectively describe and motivate this foundational understanding and make sense, help us make sense. And in any kind of scientific endeavor, that's what we're up to. We're trying to make sense of the natural world. And in the case of evolution, we're trying to make sense, and I love the title of this core idea. We're trying to make sense of 2 things simultaneously, and both of them are fascinating and lead to amazing puzzles and ideas in evolution. Both the unity, all these commonalities, the ways in which the organisms on Earth solve the problems they have to solve in order to move, to get food, to free up energy for use, to reconstruct the molecules in their body, all kinds of things. There's incredible unity across those processes, and that's a really cool link to LS1, the molecules core idea. And there's amazing diversity. There's all different ways in which those unifying processes get played out in organisms in very different ways. And that leads us to the diversity of living things on this planet, which is also pretty cool and amazing to play around with, and leads us into both ideas around heredity in LS3 and ideas around ecosystems. So when we think about these 4 ideas, looks like my slides got a little cut here. Again, not thinking about them as a sequence, when I try and make sense of the text in the framework, it helps me to think about them in sort of 2 different ways, which I'm going to show you here. The first is that LS4A and LS4B are really about phenomena and patterns in the natural world. What do I mean by that? I mean that what it highlights for us, the ways in which these core ideas play out in the framework, are the things we can notice and see in the natural world. Evidence for common ancestry, the idea that things may have similarities because they have common descent or descended from similar ancestors. And again, the ways in which we can look around and see just amazing diversity of living things across the planet. Those are things we can see and notice and begin to actually really systematically think through the patterns we see in the natural world about both similarity and difference. The second thing that we can really start to understand and appreciate when we think about what are the patterns and the phenomena that we're trying to explain is the kinds of ways in which living things have solved the problems of the environments in which they lived. In other words, how do I get food here? How do I get liquid here? How do I process and live my life in this particular environment? Those problems have been solved by organisms in a fascinating number of ways, and we can think carefully about how the particulars of an organism help it survive and reproduce and live in a particular kind of environment. But that only gets us so far. So the second half of these core ideas, or the component ideas of the core ideas, are really the models that can help us explain and question those patterns that we see. So again, I'm not suggesting a sequence here. These 2 have to talk to one another. But what I am suggesting is that one set of these component ideas are really about the patterns and the phenomena, and one set of these core ideas unpacks and explores the models that underlie. So natural selection being one major model within the framework and has its own component idea, and then speciation and extinction as another set of models that underlie and drive evolutionary processes. So again, instead of thinking about this as a sequence, we can think about the relationships between each one of these things. So what's the relationship between what we see in terms of common ancestry and natural selection? What's the relationship between the amazing diversity we see and adaptation, for example, and so on? And you can see I just made this mess of arrows to just try and keep keep us going and keep us understanding that these things are all interrelated. And as we think about instruction, we have to really play around with and think about the correspondence between what we see in the natural world and the models and explanations we have for those things. So I said earlier that the work that I've done has really been around modeling in the science classroom. And I think, and so to step back and just remind us that modeling is one of the 8 practices that are also in the framework and NGSS. And to step back and be a little bit clear about what I mean by modeling, when I talk about modeling, I'm talking about being explicit about making public and using a small set of ideas that explain the natural world. And so that's what this modeling view is all about. And therefore, if our goal is to take things in the natural world and develop theoretical ideas that help us explain them, and then use those theoretical ideas to explain other things in the natural world and refine those theoretical ideas along the way, then we're not covering topics. We're sense making. And that's what we are supposed to be doing in the next generation science standards. And I'm sure many of you, and that's your main endeavor in your classroom. So the phenomena both motivate the need to develop the models and are explained using the models. And likewise, the models play back and help us even know what to look at and notice about the phenomena, and are impacted by our views of the world. Okay. So to go a little bit further on this modeling thing, just because I'm going to use this word a lot tonight, models serve the purpose as being a tool for thinking with, making predictions and making sense of experience. And scientists use models to represent their current understanding of the system under study. So we create explanations from our models. We know what to look for from our models. We know what to investigate because we have a model. And all of those things, as they play out, also impact our models. Okay, so let's stop for a second and just open it up a little bit and think about whether or not there's anything you want to add to this notion of the way in which the content has been chunked in the 4 component ideas of the natural selection, adaptation, evidence for unity and diversity, and sort of the speciation extinction issue with regard to human influence. Does anybody have anything they want to ask or talk about?
Okay, there's someone writing directly on the whiteboard. Probably the best place is probably the chat box, but feel free to finish your sentence there. But if you do have some questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. So we'll let that one finish on the screen there, and then maybe see if there's 1 or 2 others. So there's already a question in the chat box from Luana, who asks, how do you make a model of evolution?
Yeah, so I think one way to think about it, and we'll talk more about this as we go, is that evolution is a big area, and that we have a number of models that help us account for evolution. So when I think about something like evolution, or genetics is the same way, I think about a number of models that sort of underlie that. So for example, the natural selection model is a piece of evolution. It explains part of the mechanism of change over time. But we can also imagine that only gets us so far. We need to sort of have models of speciation. If we have a model of extinction, in other words, and that's a pretty straightforward model that just includes getting down to a point where you have too few individuals left living to survive, and the kinds of things that might drive organisms into extinction, habitat loss, a loss of genetic diversity, things like that, then all of those things collectively help us understand how life has changed over time on Earth and the spatial distribution of different kinds of organisms on Earth. So a number of different models come to play in the broad area of evolution. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, I think.
And the like to address the question that's on the whiteboard. In case hopefully it's finished, can you speak to the cross-cutting ideas with evolution from physics and chemistry, I assume?
Yeah, so the cross-cutting ideas, I'm not totally sure I understand the question, so let me tell you what I think you mean, and then you can correct me in your typing if you want. So the cross-cutting ideas in NGSS and the framework are some of these big ideas around systems and sort of stability and change and things like that. And I think all of those ideas can be productively woven into the content of biology. I do think it's a little bit harder stretch for us to get directly into physics and chemistry content in this particular core idea of chemistry and physics. So things like cause and effect, systems and system models, stability and change are things that have been identified as cross-cutting concepts by the framework writers, and those to me make a great deal of sense to pop up and make very explicit and clear in the classroom. The notion of stability and change is sort of at the core of natural selection, and to help students notice how it plays out in this content area and how it might play out differently in, say, chemical equilibrium, but in both cases we're sort of thinking about how things stay the same and how they change, are sort of, that's the way I guess I think about that.
Okay, we've got a question from Brianna, which is, why is extinction a model and not an adaptation?
So when I say model, I'm talking about a set of ideas that we use to make sense of something in the natural world. So extinction is something that happens that we can observe. So in a sense, the word extinction, I think, is actually a phenomenon. But we might have models for understanding how extinction happens. And that includes so it includes a couple of constructs within that model. The notion of a species, and a reproductively isolated group of individuals, that when they are all gone, that gene pool is gone, they are gone from the earth. That particular constellation or collection of genetics, of genes, is gone from the earth forever. And then a model of extinction, or a model for understanding how extinction works, would also include what are some of the drivers that would either reduce that genetic diversity so far that the reproductive cycle is disrupted permanently, or create the conditions under which an organism can no longer compete, so an invasive species situation or a loss of habitat or whatever. So I can imagine developing with kids a model for explaining extinction that includes the notion of what a species is and why that's a sort of independent, collective, reproductively isolated collection of genes, so to speak, and how particular things that happen in the natural world might drive that group of organisms to a point where they can no longer reproduce, and therefore that particular collection of genes is lost. I hope that sort of answers that question.
Okay, and maybe one last question before we move on. We've got a question from Michael, who is a grade 7 teacher and is about to embark on his unit of evolution and adaptation. And I guess he's looking for some tips on what he should aim at that development level. That may be hard to explain in a few sentences, but maybe you have a few tips for him.
Well, it's actually right where we're going next, so maybe it's a good transition to go to the next section of our talk here, which is really going to take up this question of both learning progressions and the kinds of common ideas that students bring to the biology classroom that both enhance and impede their ability to think about evolutionary phenomena and the models that underlie them. So in your handy-dandy NGSX document, if you have the hard copy, it comes as a separate little book and or obviously accessible online. There's an appendix, E, that does the learning progressions for all of the core ideas. And that just sort of lays out broadly what kids should be grappling with at each grade band. And you'll see that in the case of LS4, evolution, unity, and diversity, the broad core idea, there's not a lot going on at the K2 level, except that we want kids to be exploring. We want kids to be explaining or exploring that we see a range of organisms in different places. So the idea of biodiversity is something that kids can be grappling with even from very young ages. I have young children myself, and we are constantly noticing and wowing about all the crazy things that we come across, all the different kinds of living things, and we wonder and we think about where they live and if they could live in other places and that kind of thing. So that's some of the stuff that we can be focused on at the K2 level. When we move up to grades 3-5, we're really focusing more on, again, the patterns and the phenomena in the natural world that eventually, as kids become more sophisticated, we're going to be able to explain on a mechanistic level. But first, we want to get the patterns down. So what are some of the things that we see in the natural world? We see that living things resemble organisms that once lived on the earth. Again, my little kids right now, 4-year-old twins, are fascinated with dinosaurs. So they are constantly asking questions and wondering about and reading books and grappling with this notion that there were these amazing living things on this planet a long time ago that aren't here anymore, and yet there are some ways in which they're similar. And we had a really interesting conversation just the other night about the duck-billed dinosaurs and about the various dinosaurs that seem more closely related to birds. And they were wondering about some of those sort of patterns. So again, that's a pattern that kids can be exposed to and really explore deeply. And then that leads to questions about extinction and how things may have died out, and the fact that the sort of plethora of life on Earth is ever changing, and the constellation of different species that make up the group of living things on Earth at any given time has changed a lot over Earth's history. And then the question around differences in characteristics between individuals of the same species is one, we'll talk about this later when we talk about common student ideas, but that I think is maybe perhaps one of the most important seeds that can be sown early on in a child's development that will be super productive later when they begin to think about evolutionary mechanisms. We find that kids don't have a very good understanding of variation, yet it's all around us all the time. And if kids can be zeroed in to think systematically about the variation they see and wonder about it, they're being set up for later on. The match to organisms and their environment and the range of habitats on Earth is another productive place to look for patterns and phenomena. Again, so this is at the sort of K5 level, really exploring and coming to a deep and clear understanding of a number of these patterns, then lead us into the middle school level, where really we're thinking about those patterns and phenomena and the ideas of common descent as beginning to be explanatory ideas. So if we think about things having common descent, then we can start to explain the notion that things are similar, very similar to each other, and some of the differences. So this is a place to begin to think about mechanism, and the way the framework lays it out is to start, as probably many of you do, with sort of artificial selection context and experiences for kids to think about, well, how do we get all these different dog breeds, or lots and lots of examples from agriculture. We used to bring in a pigeon breeder into one of the classes in which I worked with this amazing array of show pigeons, which is a fascinating subculture in and of itself, and just crazy things that you can get when you are invoking artificial selection. And of course, Darwin himself used a lot of reasoning around artificial selection and animal husbandry in his own arguments. So that's a productive place to begin thinking about mechanisms with kids on a microevolutionary scale. And that's sort of the way the framework has laid this out. And then when we get to the high school level, really going deep into more sophisticated understandings of patterns and phenomena at the molecular level, in terms of DNA sequences and amino acid sequences, etc., and really going deep on natural selection versus artificial selection and population level thinking, and understanding the way in which natural selection can lead to the amazing array of adaptations that we see. The other thing that happens in 912, again, is bringing in a broader perspective around speciation and extinction to explain patterns and changes across time in the biodiversity of this planet, and in particular to begin exploring human impacts on biodiversity and why that might be problematic. Okay, so that's sort of the way this progression is laid out in the Appendix E. And so let's take a look at a couple of performance expectations that will just help us think. So remember, a performance expectation is always a combination of a practice, DCI, and a cross-cutting idea, if I can weave it in. Those ones are not as consistent, I've noticed. So you see at the K2 level, this notion that you're making observations of plants and comparing the diversity of life and looking at different habitats. So remember, the sort of goal or the first stage in the learning progression laid out in Appendix E is just that you notice there's lots of different things and they live in different places. And then as you get into K3-5, you begin to think about the match between organisms and their environments and the ways in which they are, they may have particular advantages within, again, looking carefully at the variation within a set of organisms, and then also thinking about extinct organisms and how life on Earth has changed over time. At the middle school level now, we're expecting kids to be able to analyze and interpret data in a slightly different way from the fossil record, to think both about the diversity and extinction and get a better sort of set idea about the progression of life on Earth. Progression's the wrong word. The way in which life on Earth has changed over time, and that we might have some natural explanations for this change over time. So that evolution has happened is essentially what this performance expectation is about. And then thinking again about similarities now, not just differences, between extinct organisms and modern organisms, to begin to get into this notion of tree thinking. So what does it mean to say descent with modification over time, or common ancestry? What are we talking about? Why does that how does that play out in the existing organisms that we see, and going back into deep history? Analyze displays of pictorial data, again, looking at similarities in embryological development to think about relational connections between living organisms and extinct organisms, and to construct now we're beginning to get to this. All of these were sort of analytical with data, again, patterns and phenomena in the natural world, and now we're thinking about explanations where we see how a trait in population may increase based on differential survival. And at the high school level now is really where natural selection comes into play very strongly, with this first performance expectation that really is the natural selection model laid out in 4 pieces that then you could use to construct an explanation. You apply concepts of statistics and probability, really getting students into this probabilistic reasoning that's at the heart of so much of population biology and evolutionary thinking. A more close connection, again, between the adaptations we see in the natural world and the natural selection mechanisms that may have led to those adaptations, and this notion that we can think about species emergence and extinction over time on Earth. Again, these weren't all the performance expectations related to this core idea, but these are some of the key. So this just gives you a sense of how this plays out as we go up the grade bands, and and how the actual performance expectations are written from the framework ideas. And one thing I'm going to say here, as I've been doing a lot of work, as probably many of you have too, trying to make sense of these documents, the framework and the NGSS document itself, my initial inclination was to start at the performance expectation level. Sort of look at a performance expectation and think about what that would mean for instruction or curriculum or whatnot. And the more I've done that, the more I've realized that I've spent a lot of time in the orange foundation box, which is the disciplinary core idea box, trying to understand the sort of range of content that is under the umbrella of the performance expectations above it. The problem with the orange foundation box is they are verbatim, for the most part, from the framework. But the problem with them is they're sort of chunked in funny ways that make it hard to understand totally. And so for me, the more I'm doing this and the more I'm grappling with these documents, the more I'm going back and forth between the framework and the narrative descriptions of the core ideas. And then I go to the performance expectations for sort of a more detailed, pieced out look. For me anyway, I've found that starting at the performance expectation level is really hard to really understand what's the full expectation here in terms of the content. So that's just a little tip. I don't know if other people are finding that. You could put it in the chat. But about how even to read these documents. And just as I'm doing curriculum work in schools, finding that the performance expectations aren't maybe the most productive place to start, even though that would be, I think, the intuitive thing to do and was at least for me. Okay, so now let's think about student ideas a little bit. I guess I want to say here that the position I take is that students come with both productive and unproductive intuitive ideas, especially around evolutionary concepts, but you could say that about anything that they come into the classroom with. And that our aim as teachers should be to leverage these ideas rather than like root out the wrong ones and toss them away. And the reason I say that is that I think a lot of times there's a lot of focus and there's a lot of literature on misconceptions students have. And I'm not going to sit here and say that students don't have ideas that get in the way of teaching evolution and natural selection. They definitely do. But rather than thinking about them as things you want to like get rid of, you might think about them as things you could capitalize on. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we go. So the first set of ideas I want to talk about here are ideas that students have about variation, or should I say the sort of way in which they don't actually activate or pull on resources they have, intellectual resources they have around variation when they're thinking about evolution for whatever reason. So if you were to ask kids in the abstract, they could tell you a lot about the ways in which humans vary from one another. But like scientists in Darwin's time, they think about that as the noise, not the signal. In other words, they think about animals in particular, but probably plants and microorganisms in what historians of science call an essentialistic way. They think about the essence of the organism, and they'll say things like, how does the baby zebra find its mom? All the zebras look the same. And they don't think about the fact that if you're a zebra, all the zebras do not look the same. And in fact, they vary from each other a lot. So they sort of have in their head this essentialistic idea of a zebra or an elephant or a daisy or whatever. And they think of the ways in which those things vary from one another as not worthy of their attention. And this was actually part of Darwin's major achievement, was to look around him and see the amazing diversity both among and between organisms and say, hang on a second, this is what we should be paying attention to. It's the variation that's the driver here, they're not imperfections as many people during Darwin's time thought of them. They are the fuel for evolution. And so as early as we can to get kids thinking hard about how to characterize the ways in which organisms in a single population or of a single species vary from one another has super productive payoff later on when they go to learn about natural selection. Another place where kids often fall down or have trouble is, let me back up for 1 second to talk about this notion of productive versus unproductive. So I'm sort of highlighting the fact that kids seem to when they think about non-human organisms, they don't pay attention to variation. But they do actually have a very productive idea in their heads about variation when they're talking about humans. So what we need them to do is think about other organisms in terms of variation in the same way they think about our own species. And so they have both an unproductive and sort of a productive idea in their head, and for us, we want to push them toward that productive idea they have about humans and start to see why that might matter for other organisms. Okay, so probabilistic reasoning is another one. When kids think about evolutionary phenomena, sometimes this seems not very plausible to them because of the nature of this very deterministic idea, and the idea that things, that differential survival, more surviving, or likely to look like my parents, or any of those kinds of hedges feel like hedges to students, instead of feeling like when you have a probability of something happening, a higher probability of something happening, that matters over time. So to help kids think about the probabilistic nature of survival and reproduction instead of a deterministic one. So if you have the advantageous trait, you will survive, is often the way kids kind of think about it. And that's not super productive for kids, because then they don't understand why everything's not perfect. And they don't understand why evolution doesn't happen more quickly, or things like that. And so if you can help them understand that in the broad range of the variation we see, some variations are more likely to survive or give the organism a better chance of survival, and their offspring sometimes are more likely to look like their parents than not, or to have that particular trait, then you can start to see this very incremental and slow process, but powerful process. So that's what I have to say about probabilistic reasoning. Proximal and ultimate causation is probably a too fancy way to say what a lot of you, I'm sure, have experienced, and sometimes in the literature is labeled as Lamarckian language. And what that means is that kids think about the immediate needs of the organism. The giraffe had to reach up and get the leaves, and so it stretched its neck out, is the canonical story that people tell, as being the thing that's driving the change over time. And so a lot of times kids think about these immediate needs. This is really productive, actually, for kids to think about the needs of the organism. And sometimes they, and I will say scientists, are very sloppy with their language. They'll say, oh, giraffes have longer necks because they needed them in order to reach high and occupy an ecological niche that was available to be exploited or whatever. Kids don't say that part. But they would say they needed longer necks. And then we jump all over them as teachers. No, 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 the giraffes didn't need longer necks. The ones who happened to have longer necks were more likely to survive, and they're more likely to have long neck offspring, and those offspring were at advantage, and blah, blah, blah. But to think about adaptation in terms of meeting a need or solving a problem is a productive way to think about how organisms interact with their environment. It's just that we have to make certain that kids don't then keep going down that path and think that something that changes within an organism's lifetime matters for the evolution of the population over time. So I, as an individual giraffe, might have a longer neck and be doing better, but if that longer neck is an acquired characteristic, I can't pass that on to my offspring, so it doesn't matter in an evolutionary sense. So again, kids have both productive and unproductive ideas about this sort of proximal versus ultimate causation and interaction. Another piece that kids struggle with is the difference, or the going from micro level to macro evolution. So, okay, I can buy that we can do amazing things to pigeons by selectively breeding them, blah, 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 but how does that help me explain the many, many different species of birds in the world today? And to help kids understand deep time is a part of this. to help kids understand the nature of the sort of the fodder for evolution, again, as for natural selection, as being around the genetically inherited variations and where those come from and how they connect, connecting again to the core idea around heredity. All of these connections are really important for them to begin to see how a micro level process of selection can lead to the macro evolutionary context in which we examine Earth's biodiversity. And then the last one I'll talk about is this notion of everyday versus scientific use of language. And a couple words that I'll just highlight here is the word adaptation is one. When we talk about something adapting in normal speech, we're actually talking about something doing something itself that's probably not genetically controlled. So I put sunscreen on to adapt to a sunny day. That's not something that's going to be translated down the line genetically for my kids, although maybe I'm smart enough to put sunscreen on, I don't know. Anyway, so adaptation is one. Fitness, I'm sure many of you have come across, is another one. So there are a number of words that we use in evolutionary biology in a particular way, and students sometimes have a different version of that. Again, it's not always unproductive. There's a nugget of sort of the right idea in the way in which we typically use adaptation or fitness, but it's not quite aligned with the way scientists use those words. So we might just make that very evident and clear to students and help them use the right thing. So another word like that is need. An organism needs something. This often is a red flag to us, and we think that is sort of invoking a teleological or Lamarckian kind of idea, but it may not be. It may be just shorthand for talking about evolutionary adaptation. So we just need to be careful that we don't false alarm on language too. Okay, so let me stop babbling for a few minutes and see if there are questions or things people want to talk about.
And again, the best place to probably put your questions is in the chat box. It'll probably be a bit easier than the text tool, at least for this exercise. So I think there's at least one person writing, so we'll just wait a minute or so if we get started. And in case you don't have any questions and you're ready to move on, feel free to give us a green check, which is just under your name above the participant window there.
Okay, ready to move on. I'm seeing the check, the green check. Oh, but I do see this note that someone, Gabriella just wrote about use of language. And one thing I will say, and it's funny because I'm sitting in the same spot, so I feel like I'm talking to the same people, and maybe some of you attended the NSTA virtual conference this weekend, but I gave a talk on modeling. And one of the things that I highlighted in that talk was the use of terminology in service of sense making rather than for its own sake. And I saw a couple comments in the chat around this. I think that the writers of the framework were very, very deliberate in terms of the way they used scientific vocabulary and jargon, and I really appreciate that. I think we want kids to know some scientific words for sure. But I know when I used to be a high school science teacher, I would start, and this was in the early 90s, I would start every unit with a big old vocabulary blast. Make your flashcards, take your quiz, because I had this sort of, I took this position like they can't do anything until they know the language. And I was so frustrated that just never worked, and these are my first couple of years of teaching. It just didn't feel like it was working, and I didn't understand why. And then I sort of, over time, you know, being mentored by really great science teachers, came to understand that if kids don't have any experience or conception or idea about the natural world to hook those words on, they are just so much gibberish to them. And so to build up the experience for students and then apply the label is so much more powerful for kids and lasting learning for them. So there are lots of words we want kids to know, certainly in the context of evolution, unity, and diversity. I think of the disciplinary core ideas in biology, it is probably the most language friendly. In other words, there's the lowest, there's the fewest crazy words. There's no endoplasmic reticulum. There's no homozygote. There's no any of those kinds of words that are truly gibberish to middle and high school kids. But we do want to use the language very deliberately. So I'll stop there. Okay, so what I've done now is I've pulled a couple resources for us to think through what it might look like to develop some of these ideas. And what I mean by exploring the phenomena in deep ways and then going to mechanistic sort of causal reasoning around what we see in the natural world and continuing the back and forth between what we see in the natural world and our theoretical ideas that help us understand and explain those things and how we might help kids develop those ideas. So again, to remind you that the 4 component parts are totally interlocking and interweaving and not sequential. And to remind you that in all of our teaching now with NGSS, we want to be focused on teaching by engaging students in scientific and engineering practices. These are the 8 practices as they've been laid out in the framework. I'll be talking about pretty much all of them throughout this next bit. So one of the resources I have posted here, and you're free to go to this website, is work that I did many years ago in Wisconsin called Modeling for Understanding in Science Education. I do think it's still quite well aligned to the vision of the Next Generation Science Standards in the NRC framework. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the crux of this unit is and the way in which some teachers I've worked with much more recently have adapted it. Oh, I should have put here and I didn't. There's also a very recent science teacher article. I'll try and find the link, or maybe someone could be really industrious and find the link to that article that was just in the science teacher, I guess it was in the fall, around these this curriculum. So basically this curriculum was written for high school, but I know folks have used it down in the middle school level. And it's around natural selection. So what do I mean by the natural selection model? Will become evident here in a few minutes. But it begins with phenomena that we would look at in the natural world and develop a driving question about. Those phenomena, different teachers have used different things. Sometimes they're things like antibiotic resistance. The peppered moth, I'm going to show you an example of that in a few minutes. Any kind of change over time or adaptation that we see in the world could serve as phenomena that would get us to a driving question that goes something like, how did it get like that? Where did that adaptation come from? How do organisms change over time, which is the change piece is the crux, of course, of evolution. In order to answer that driving question, they analyze a series of data sets using simulations and other ways to get at pieces of the natural selection model, including variation, the potential for exponential growth, competition, and then they develop the natural selection model ideas. I'm going to show you a graphic organizer about that in just a second. And then they apply the model to create an explanation for some observed adaptation or extant feature of modern day organisms that can be addressed from an evolutionary perspective, and then they extend the model. So what does that really look like? The teachers with whom I have been working most recently have taken this depiction of Darwin's model that was actually developed by Ernst Mayr in his book One Long Argument. If you want to be a real evolutionary biology aficionado, you got to read some Ernst Mayr. He's great. And anyway, this book, One Long Argument, has a nice sort of captures a lot about Darwin's achievement. And he put all of this into this graphic. And basically what it does is it takes us through sort of the things we can observe, the potential for exponential increase, or super fecundity, if you want to get the fancy scientific word. So we know that organisms could increase exponentially just if we were just to do the math on any given organism and the number of offspring they had. If all of those offspring survived generation after generation, we would have crazy growth patterns, right? But that's not what we see in the world. We see steady state. And we know that resources in the world are limited. So this leads us to the first inference, which is there's a struggle for survival among individuals of the same species. And we notice that individuals within a species vary from one another, and a lot of that variation is inherited. From these, we can come to the second inference, which is that, some variations increase the likelihood of survival. And if those and we already said those variations are heritable, those particular ones that increase the survival rate, and through many generations we have evolution. So this is what we mean when we say model. The teachers with whom I've worked don't use this exact wording. This is more related to the way Ernst Mayr laid this out. It's slightly modified for kids, but they modified it even further. I can't remember exactly. They have fewer boxes. But what they do is they go through this sort of stepwise with their kids. They look at exponential growth of organisms, and they do some math problems like, what would happen if all the flies, if one pair of flies and all of their babies survived in one summer? How many flies would you have around your house? Oh my gosh, it's a lot. It's crazy. You can't even think about it. But we don't have 1 million. Our house is not overrun by flies, etc. And through a sort of stepwise fashion, they establish all of these ideas in their classroom, and then they give kids something to explain. The first thing might be fairly straightforward. In the curriculum that I put the link to, once they have used the natural selection model to explain a fairly straightforward case, they go to a much more complicated case where the actual advantage is not so obvious. And so one of the cases we've used is a case of monarchs and viceroys. So in this case, even just the brightly colored monarchs are kind of surprising and jarring. Why would they be brightly colored? That doesn't seem like it would be advantageous. So first I have to grapple with what's the advantage of being brightly colored? And then I have to grapple with, and why would an unrelated, because I know they're unrelated by looking at this tree, why would an unrelated species have a very similar set of markings? And the kids are given all kinds of data in a packet to make sense of and use their natural understanding of natural selection to explain. And now they're sort of pushing the bounds of their natural selection model because they're playing with some ideas where it's not so obvious what the advantage is. And that's really actually turns out to be really useful for kids to push their understanding of this idea. Okay, I'm going to take you through another set of ideas around how to create a sort of investigation environment. This is from some middle school curricula. Many of you know who Brian Reiser is. He's a science educator, learning scientist at Northwestern. He's developed some middle school curricula called iQuest. This is sort of taking us through some of the pathway of how that curricula goes. And again, it can help you see this exploration of the phenomena and then invoking the theoretical model ideas to explain. So this one begins with the story of the peppered moth. The kids are immediately alerted to this sort of interesting question of why did the dark form become more frequent than the light form in the late 1800s, and then the big question, why the populations changed over time. So they're given some information about these moths, and then they do a jigsaw where they're given even more information about one kind of research study. Maybe one was on pollution, one was on predation, one was on pollution reduction, and one was on inheritance, how that particular trait of dark versus light or speckled coloration is actually inherited. And they're asked to answer these questions. What do the results tell us about our research questions? And then they jigsaw that. So, for example, they might figure out, oh, the pollutions affected the plants and other organisms where the moths lived. And this is what the researchers were doing. They answered these two research questions, and so this is the summary of the pollution stuff. So here's my motivation for why I even care about this, and here are the research questions, and here are the results that as a student I'm going to grapple with and try and understand how this relates to the bigger picture of what I'm trying to build. And so it's a very data-driven kind of experience for kids. And as they go through, they begin to come up with this explanation about how the moths in the forest look because of the effects of population. They cite their evidence, and then they can basically invoke something that's very close to a natural selection model. And you can see that the students sort of are doing this very kind of causal reasoning. This is because my evidence for this, that kind of thing. A little sensitive to the time here, so I'm going to push through. But again, you can see through these underlined words the kinds of reasoning that students are doing. So really the key here is they are developing explanations in both cases, both curricula that I've talked about. They're developing explanations based on an understanding of the natural selection model. And one way to think about this is typically in science classrooms, they learn about the science idea. They're told about natural selection and they're asked to tell someone else the steps, someone on a test or whatever, the steps of natural selection. The difference here, and the way in which this is aligned with NGSS, is that the students are actually figuring out how and why natural selection works the way it does, and they're developing a model that can be used in the explanation. So that's the way in which these curricula are really aligned to NGSS. So another really cool resource, again, developed by the folks at Northwestern, is this Galapagos finches database. This is one, I'll give you the link at the end here where you can go and play around with the data here. It's a very, again, data-driven thing. And the question that you're trying to solve when you go into this environment is to explain the decrease in the finches and why some finches were able to survive. So again, you're sort of going to invoke the natural selection model, but in the face of specific data. You get to explore the Galapagos Islands a bit and understand the ecosystem. So again, this is a place to link in the core ideas around ecology and carrying capacity and competition and those things. And then you have data about these birds and what happened to them over time in different contexts. There's lots of graphs that get generated, and you get to generate them depending on what critters you choose to look at. So there's all kinds of information about each of these finches that the students go in and marshal and look for patterns in and try and figure out. And in the course of doing that, they're really thinking about, again, the natural selection component. So there's a change in the environment, and we have information around seasons and rainfall. There's variation in the population. You just saw that you get to see all these individuals and see the way they vary from one another and really look at their morphology. And there's information about trait inheritance. They see that the distribution of these characteristics changes over time in the finches, and they understand from the field notes that there's a structure-function relationship between survival and what the finches are able to do. So I encourage you to go look at this. It's pretty cool. So the kinds of things that students generate here are things like this. The finches with longer beaks had a better chance of survival than those with shorter beaks. All of the dry seasons had very little rain. However, all the wet seasons, blah, blah, blah. And this proves that there was a drought. There were fewer seeds in the seasons where there was a big die-off, and they can begin to look at the morphological characteristics that help the finches survive. So this is the end here. So when we think about what these cases are doing for us, the peppered moth, or you could add in the monarch viceroy here too. It leads us to the natural use of the natural selection model. This is another different kind of depiction of the natural selection model from the one that I showed you a few minutes ago. And so one thing I want to tell you as teachers is that there's sort of no magic way. The idea here is not that we reproduce canonical knowledge for students, that they just are able to tell us the steps of natural selection. That's not the idea. The idea, so that would be a topic-y way to go about it. The idea is that they have explored and understood these foundational pieces that lead them to invoke theoretical ideas around evolution and species change. In this case, natural selection, that can help them to really figure out what they're seeing. Okay, so this is the resource. When I talked with Brian earlier today, he said, feel free to go and play around and mess around with the Galapagos finches stuff. If you're actually going to use it with your kids, which he would love for you to do, if you would just register, because they just want to monitor the usage of it and see how people are using it in different ways. So I'm going to end there and let us have some time for questions and evaluation and everything else. So that's kind of my big wrap, is just to say that I hope that this opportunity that we have with NGSS allows us to really sort of embrace and cultivate the notion of foundational generative knowledge in science, not topic-driven discrete facts. And that if we can think about these contexts that we put kids in as modeling contexts and contexts in which they're engaged in practices, I think all of that will sort of come along. But if we just think about, oh, well, now I just need to I used to call it natural selection, and now I'll call it the natural selection model, that's going to be more problematic. So that's kind of where I'm going to land here.
Great. Thank you so much, Cindy. Okay, we'll just switch to the next slide here. Let's all give Cindy a huge round of applause. We've got Jeff starting already, so go ahead and find your emoticon there. And either put your hand up, as lots of people are doing, or use the smiley faces or the applause. So those are really great examples that I'm sure that everyone, based on the chat, that everyone really appreciated. So I think what we're going to do, we'll take the questions at the end of the session. We'll just get through a few more slides and our evaluation, and then you have a chance to ask Cindy as many questions as you like. So I'd also like to thank NGSS at NSTA for sponsoring today's web seminar, as well as the individuals at the NSTA team, as well as the web seminar team, which includes Jeff, who's also here tonight with us, helping us out. You can find resources related to today's presentation by going to the web seminar collection in the NSTA Learning Center, which is going to include the archive of the web seminar as well as the presentation slides. The collection may also include journal articles and lesson plans, as well as interactive content modules called Science Objects and SciPacks, and links to helpful websites and multimedia. I'm going to put the direct link to this collection in the window in just a moment, but also just to remind you that everyone who has registered for the program is going to receive an email in the next day or so with a link to access the archive and the collection and all of those resources. Here's a look at what's coming up in the web seminar calendar. So let me see, we're jumping way ahead here. You know what? This is an old slide. So I think the best thing to do, if you take our apologies there, is go to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars, and there you'll have the proper list of seminars. So this must have been just kind of put in here by accident, but there are many more sessions that are happening before June 25th, and of course it's already 2014. So go ahead and have a look online at the NSTA Learning Center for the most updated events. And so with that, thank you everyone for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again at another NSTA web seminar.